Last week, my dad called me to congratulate me on my first episode of the podcast. And he said, Amy, I listened to my toothless era, and I just can't believe that you didn't even talk about how much you suffered. And I said, Dad, you're right. I didn't really get into that. I think I need a whole episode to talk about suffering. So, the question today is, what do you do when the suffering won't stop and you don't know why it's happening to you? So there's two different types of suffering that I see. There's the visible suffering and then there's invisible suffering. So I'll walk you through a couple of examples, personal stories from my own life that I want to share with you. But before we get into that, I really want to talk about where suffering falls on an energetic level and what people tend to do when the suffering goes into the lower energetic state. So, the lower energy associated with suffering would be things like apathy, meaning, what's the point? Nothing matters anymore. Or grief. I've lost something that I can't get back. That type of suffering. And then finally, there's a fear based suffering. What if this never gets better? Right? And I'm sure you can identify, I'd like you to think about areas in your life where you are currently or have experienced suffering, and we can dissect this together. Along the path of suffering, we do get faced with a choice of how are we going to process this experience? How are we going to let this experience form us and shape us and impact us? So, a couple of stories I can share with you. One being self inflicted suffering. In my 20s, I made a handful of very poor choices. And the results were that I created suffering in my own life. And I came to the conclusion pretty quickly. Like, I realized that I had screwed up, and my thought process was that I am not going to let this be in vain. I'm not going to just go through this suffering and not be wiser for the wear. So I transformed those experiences where I was suffering, where I had made my bed and now I get to sleep in it kind of thing going on. I decided that I'm not like, yeah, it sucks. I had some outcomes and some after the fact from my poor decisions where I had to deal with the ramifications, but it still stays with me today that anytime I'm in a suffering situation, especially if it's self-inflicted suffering, that I make a decision to let that be a lesson. Let it be a lesson so that you don't have to repeat this suffering in the future, right? Now, the other type of suffering might be something more like, well, in my situation, I can easily talk about medical malpractice and how much suffering I experienced by being in the wrong hands and not having a great plan and having someone who was just hacking away at my mouth. I had 5 surgeries with this woman that I thought was a great holistic dentist, but every surgery just kept getting worse and worse and worse until finally, by the third surgery, I felt so powerless. I felt so exhausted. I just felt battered. I was physically in pain and also the emotional turmoil and the anxiety around figuring out all my dental stuff and then the anxiety leading up to being in the chair and knowing that, I had a deep inner knowing that this was not going to go well and like had to mentally and emotionally prepare for being in a chair where I would be crying for a 2-hour appointment, white knuckling through it and not being given any other option. It was insane. So that type of suffering, I guess you could argue that that was also self-inflicted because I made the choice to return to that dentist. However, I'm talking about the context of like I'm experiencing physical and emotional pain. A more extreme case of this would be Viktor Frankl. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, which it's a book that absolutely transformed my thinking. I read it when I was in my 20s. And, Viktor Frankl, he was a victim of the Holocaust. And I say victim like that because he chose through his situation. Of course, he could make the choice to be the victim. That's what's going on there. You're being abused and you're being completely stripped of all your dignity and all of your freedoms and your ability to be a human, except for your ability to choose your own attitude. And that's what Viktor Frankl boiled his experience down to, is that no one can take that freedom away from you. And what an inspiring story. I mean, the most radical suffering experience that you could probably imagine. And that was his takeaway. So if you haven't read the book or at least gotten a more in depth summary of his experience, I highly recommend that. And I think this idea that suffering becomes bearable when there is meaning associated with the suffering. So for my string of poor choices in my 20s, the meaning that I had associated with the outcomes, the suffering that I had, it was like, look, I'm going to grow from this. Like, those are some dumb choices, and I'm not going to repeat that again. Wiser for the wear. Same with the dental experience. Like, wow, I am never going to be in this situation again. I'm going to use this situation to learn how to be a better advocate for myself, to learn how to speak up, to learn to not be a yes person or a people pleaser or be an easy patient. So, those takeaways, the suffering didn't end immediately, right? The suffering was actually, it had just started. And me coming to the conclusion that now I'm going to assign meaning to these suffering experiences actually made everything more bearable. And that is a huge piece of my mental framework for how I approach life now, because suffering can come in small doses or huge ginormous doses. Um, One example that I think is so interesting is, on a hot day, it can, certain people love the heat. I love the heat. But I know certain people who, if they're hot, it's suffering, right? They're just like they're on a hot summer day and they're overheating. And there's this perspective of, oh my gosh, I'm miserable and this is just terrible. And then there's also the perspective of, there is a star that's 93 million miles away that is causing me to feel warm right now. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that amazing that that's why I'm feeling hot right now? So I think there's a few different ways that we can approach dissecting suffering, but the bottom line is, anytime we feel suffering, we do have a choice. We can go into the lower energetic states such as apathy, grief, and fear. And if you are in one of those places, I encourage you just to feel those feelings, accept those feelings for what they are, and let them pass. We don't have to remain attached to our feelings or let our feelings dictate what our circumstance actually is. So, one of the best privileges in life is being exposed to alternative viewpoints on how you can look at your own situation. What if, instead of choosing to stay in apathy, grief, or fear, what if we choose courage? I can face this. That's badass, right? Willingness, meaning I'm open to what this is teaching me. That's one that I love. I find myself there often. What can I learn from this? And then finally, can we choose acceptance? I don't have to understand it to move through it. And in fact, I don't even have to resist it. There's something beautiful about acceptance, and that you stop fighting it and you just let it unfold, and then it passes. I know a lot of people will challenge spiritual viewpoints and say, oh, that's toxic positivity. It's not, because you're choosing a framework that's going to allow you to shift from being consumed by suffering to allowing suffering to change and transform you. One of my favorite critters is the caterpillar. The reason I am so fascinated by the caterpillar is this guy gets in a cocoon, and literally, his body is being reorganized. Parts of his body liquefy. They turn into soup inside that cocoon, while the caterpillar is becoming the butterfly. And again, there's a struggle here. The body is melting down and it's reorganizing. Like, I have felt this pain before. And then you get to the point where butterfly is formed. It's formed and it's ready, yet we still have this cocoon that we need to push out of. We need to push, and you can't just cut open the cocoon and let little butterfly out. It's a necessary part of the process for the butterfly to struggle, to strengthen its wings, and to have that resistance in order to be a properly functioning butterfly at the end of all this. So I think that's a beautiful reminder of how life is. When you're feeling like mush, your soup inside that cocoon, that there's a purpose to this. There's a meaning to this reorganization, and there's a brighter future ahead, right? So, we're going to land the plane with a couple of closing thoughts for you today. The idea of a woman giving birth. One of the most beautiful things that happens on this planet. My personal opinion on this is that childbirth and having babies and being pregnant is so awesome and so beautiful and such a rewarding experience. I had very positive pregnancy experiences. There is a level of intensity when you're giving birth. I did hypno babies, and there was still a level of intensity. It's not just bloop, walk in the park. Even with the intensity of the experience, women keep coming back to it. They keep coming back to it. Why? Because there's meaning associated with the quote unquote suffering of childbirth. The purpose, it doesn't make anything hurt less, but it makes it survivable and even sacred. And I think the part of childbirth that I can really hone in on, as soon as the baby's out, it's like you forget about the last hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, whatever your labor time was. It's just completely wiped away. And all you can think about is this beautiful gift that you are now holding in your arms. So suffering becomes bearable and even meaningful the moment that you decide it's not happening to you, but that it's happening for you. You really don't have to see the whole picture, but for me, it comes back to this affirmation of everything is always working out in my favor. And that's not to gloss over the personal responsibility that is associated with your own life. Like, you are responsible for your decisions. So yes, if you make a poor decision, there will be natural consequences. It's okay. It's okay if you make a bad choice. It's okay if you make a poor decision, because everything is happening for you, not to you. And that's the difference between the victim mindset and the empowered higher agency mindset, where we can take full responsibility. And when we do that, we get the gift of growth, the gift of self reflection and self awareness. So if I look at everything that I have been through in my life, I have been through a lot of challenges, from personal and professional challenges to relationship challenges to, I mean, my whole teeth saga, all the things. And I don't wish any of it away, because if I didn't have those experiences, truly, I would not be here today, standing here and sharing this with you. So I have a lot of gratitude for the things in my life that have been struggles, the things that have been suffering experiences. And, walking through those experiences with a deep inner knowing that everything is always working out in my favor. I believe that to my core. It doesn't mean automatically, instantly, I have an easy life. It means that everything's always working out. It allows me to have a levity about my day, even if I'm in the middle of suffering. So I want to thank you for joining me today on High Agency. This is a podcast where we talk about real life, real things happening, and real ways to increase your agency so that you can have better outcomes in your life. I appreciate you listening, hanging into the end. Make sure you hit subscribe, follow me, and I will be dropping weekly 15-minute episodes. So keep your eye out.